Okay, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I think the fine-tuning argument for God is trash. Isn't that weird? I mean, it's widely regarded as one of the best weapons in apologists' arsenal, right? You'll rarely find a list of arguments for God that doesn't include it, and even a lot of atheists say they find this among the most interesting or even compelling ones. And I can see why this is. It's all too easy to fall under the impression that the universe looks designed. How can you not when you're observing from within a system that you've always lived in and that your species has adapted everything about itself to survive in? The natural processes of our universe had been in our heads for eons before we even started methodically manipulating our environment. Thus, it's very likely that the way we started manipulating our environment, indeed how we began to conceptualize this activity as design, was going to accommodate and mimic aspects of the natural universe. So how could we be expected not to put the cart before the horse and think that the universe that shaped how we understand design was not itself designed? But as intuitive as this feels, this idea is absurd once you think it through to its conclusion. So today I'm going to go through 6 problems with the fine-tuning argument, dealing specifically with the idea that the universe was fine-tuned by the current evangelical idea of a tri-omni God to support human life. Some of these will be very familiar, but I thought it was worth itemizing them for quick reference. And if you stick around to the end, you'll find that number 6 just totally blows this idea out of the water. As surely as it's going to blow your mind! Yeah, anyway, so here we go. Number 1. Most of the universe is inhospitable to human life and would instantly kill us. This one's probably familiar to most of you, and if not, you should check out the great video Dark Matter 2525 did about this. In short, it's kind of weird to think the universe is a place God fine-tuned for life when, if it were designed, it was mostly designed to kill us. It's basically made up of a vacuum we would almost immediately die in, dotted with stars that would vaporize us and planets that are almost all as deadly as space. The tiny speck of a planet we can survive on is mostly inhospitable if not deadly, and we've had to claw our way to survive in the temperate climates our species is adapted to. So even the best spots on this one speck of cosmic dust would as soon kill us as help us thrive. But because it gives us a fighting chance instead of immediately killing us like the rest of the universe, somehow people see the whole thing is designed for our survival. This self-defeating idea is articulated by Christians who suggest God put the earth just close enough to the sun to accommodate our survival. You know, a touch closer and we'd burn, a touch further and we'd freeze. But first off, it's not nearly as true as people think, given the elliptical orbit of the Earth. And even if it were, why did he design the universe with these extreme temperature variations just to precariously hang us between them? It makes no sense unless you momentarily forget the part where you think God designed the entire universe and start thinking that he had to situate the Earth in an existing inhospitable universe he was forced to work with. It seems like this is what they do. They have this weird way of looking at the Earth in isolation as if it was created as a gift by God to compensate for an existing inhospitable universe. But if you ask why he created the inhospitable universe itself, it makes no sense. The best explanation I could possibly think of is that God gave us an amazing vastness to look at with awe and eventually explore. And I guess, maybe the fact that it kills us unless we work to survive in it is part of the adventure? But that seems like the kind of pathetic justification that could be used after the fact to see design in any kind of universe. It gets even worse when you consider that, 2, it considers the odds of producing our life in particular instead of any possible kind of life an all-powerful God could have created. Let's forget that 99.99999% of the universe is a virtual death trap for humans, and instead just stand amazed that the atmosphere, water supply, temperatures, and available food on Earth are all just perfectly set up to ensure our survival. Even then, we'd have to ask ourselves, what's really so special or necessary about this arrangement? Sure, it supports our specific form of life, but what about other possible forms of life? Instead of fine-tuning Earth, could God not have created life that would have thrived on Venus instead? If he had, what would they have thought about themselves and their place in the universe? It's likely they would have marveled at how their planet's high-pressure carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere, its clouds of sulfur, its greenhouse-produced 400 degrees Celsius temperatures were all fine-tuned to support them. Maybe they, as humans do, would have seen themselves as the only possible form of life, thus concluding Venus had to have been fine-tuned to make life possible. Maybe one day they'd even point up to Earth and thank God they weren't subjected to the horrors of that frigid, toxic soup of water and oxygen. But of course we all know they'd be mistaken. Venus wasn't necessarily fine-tuned to support life. Life on Venus was just suited for the environment it lived in. But of course life will always be suited for the planet it lives on, because if it weren't, it wouldn't be there. This leads to the next point, which is 3. It assumes the universe was made to help life survive and not that life adapted to survive in the universe. On any planet there are one of two options. Either some form of proto-life develops or it doesn't. From there, the proto-life may develop into basic organisms or it may be destroyed. If successfully reproducing life develops, then each generation that follows may produce offspring suited to that environment, or it might not. If this continues to happen generation after generation, life may become cognizant of its place in the universe and develop the tools to study conditions on other planets. Now the odds of this all happening generation after generation are astronomically slim. But here's the trick. It could not happen over and over and over, and nobody would notice it didn't happen because, nobody was there to notice the failure. This means that every time conscious life does arise, it will do so against overwhelming odds and end up in an environment that adequately supports it. Meaning that natural circumstances are almost always going to produce the illusion that the universe was amazingly and elaborately designed for the survival of whoever's observing it. The fine-tuning argument overlooks this perfectly valid, parsimonious explanation, and instead just posits that a supernatural being we can't observe created the universe using unknown mechanisms and fine-tuned it to allow us to barely scrape by on one planet and die everywhere else. This misunderstanding is summed up by the famous puddle analogy in which Douglas Adams says,
"A puddle wakes up one morning and thinks, this is a very interesting world I find myself in. It fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly, really precise, isn't it? It must have been made to have me in it."
The puddle doesn't recognize that it's a fluid object that by nature will fit the shape of whatever contains it. Just as conscious life doesn't recognize that evolving and adapting is a fluid process that will always lead to life that's fit for the environment it ends up in. Next, 4. It assumes that the constants and other attributes of the universe that make life possible are random. This is where fine-tuning gets most technical. Apologists often paint a picture of the universe having settings, such as gravity and the strong nuclear force, that had to have been set up as with a bunch of dials to make the universe fit for life. If any of these dials had been nudged the tiniest bit in the wrong direction, then gravity would have been too weak or too strong, atoms would collapse, or any number of other things could go wrong and make the universe a chaotic place where life couldn't survive. So surely there had to have been someone turning these dials, right? Because they couldn't have set themselves at random. Well, first off, we simply don't know that. We know literally nothing about what made the universe the way it is, or even if anything did make it what it is in any way that's at all intuitive to us. So there's simply no reason for us to assume any of these forces could have been any different. There's no reason for us to assume there are infinite possibilities for the strength of gravity, and the choices are that it either fell on just the right one by random or was set there by a designer. Maybe gravity is just as strong as it is for some inevitable reason we can't understand. A good way to visualize this is to imagine flipping a coin. Now, how many edges might a coin possibly land on? You might say 2, but it actually has an incomprehensibly high number. It could land on heads, tails, or a seemingly infinite number of places along the rounded edge. Now, a person who read that last statement yet knows nothing about the structure of coins or how they fall might look at the outcome of a bunch of coin flips and think, wow, how amazing that a coin only falls on 2 of its infinite edges. Surely someone must be purposely setting the coin on heads or tails, because the odds of it repeatedly landing on these 2 edges are just astronomical. Now that sounds ridiculous to us, but it's what happens when you try to calculate the odds of an outcome without knowing the mechanics of the process that produces it, including when you try to calculate the odds of the constants in our universe being what they are. Second, and much more briefly, this runs into the same problem as number 2. It's discussing constants that would make our life possible. Maybe we're just the kind of life that would thrive in this universe, and maybe different life would develop in a different universe. Maybe not if the universe ended up being chaotic, but it's pretty easy to see how these lines of reasoning are based on a ton of half thought experiments that make a ton of assumptions all meant to lead to specific conclusions. And speaking of being selective, 5. It dismisses alternatives such as the multiverse hypothesis as having no evidence. Now, I'm personally not much into things like multiverses. They're extremely hypothetical, and any indication that one exists is so technical it's way over my head. So for the sake of discussion, let's just say there's no reason whatsoever to take the idea of a multiverse seriously and that it's just absolutely pointless. Fine. But is this concession any kind of victory for the Christian fine-tuning argument? I'd say no. And the common apologetic reaction of laughing at the multiverse hypothesis as a far-fetched science fiction-y sounding idea that has no evidence is kind of weird. These same apologists contend that an all-powerful bodiless spirit being spoke the universe into existence. And that's, to put it mildly, not better. But the trick is that God's already parked in believers' minds as a possibility. Because Christianity has been so deeply ingrained in our culture for centuries, it has the benefit of familiarity, so its supernatural claims feel more plausible, whereas the multiverse feels more like off-the-cuff nonsense just because it's new. This lets apologists get away with something really weird, which is deducing their way to one implausible supernatural-sounding guess about where the universe might have come from by dismissing another guess about where the universe might have come from as implausible and supernatural-sounding. But that's not how things work, and if you take a step back and look at the God hypothesis for what it is, try to see it with fresh eyes the way you see the multiverse hypothesis, hopefully you can recognize the double standard. I personally don't think far-flung paranormal guesses are helpful. But if, for some reason, you do, you should recognize that any guess is as good as any other guess because, well, they're all guesses. And finally, here's the big kicker, the one we've all been waiting for. Fine-tuning makes absolutely no sense, in fact is a totally incoherent idea at its very core, because 6. It proposes that God went out of his way to design humans with specific weaknesses just so he could design the universe to accommodate those weaknesses. Seriously, think about this. God's sitting there before the beginning of time. Literally nothing except him exists, and being all-powerful he can create whatever he wants however he wants. Naturally, being a well-adjusted being with a healthy sense of self-actualization, he decides he wants to create people to worship him. So what's he do? Well, first he'd better create a universe for them to live in, right? And he'd darn well better fine-tune that universe so it's safe for them to live in. Right? Right? Well, actually, no, because here's an interesting question. Safe for whom? For humans? Those don't exist yet. So why would God need to fine-tune the universe for them? Why make sure it included a planet with an oxygen atmosphere? That it could provide food, water, a specific temperature range? How would it even enter his head to fret over these things? Before these could be necessary or even comprehensible things for him to worry about, he would have had to invent the very idea of needing oxygen, food, and water, then go out of his way to design his creation in such a way that they had these needs. So why not just not invent those needs? What in the not yet created world would possess him to be like, okay, I'm going to make needing oxygen a thing, make my creation need oxygen, then make the universe a place that would provide oxygen? I mean, maybe he thought it was fun jumping over obstacles that he just put in front of himself, but if that was the case, there are infinite arbitrary needs he could have designed us to have before fine-tuning the universe to meet those needs. This is the problem. People are so human-centered in their thinking that they take our frailties as an inevitable part of reality that God had to contend with. But if he created everything, they're not. As I often say, for every problem God designed the universe to solve, he would have also had to design the problem. And it gets even worse, because this isn't just a question of why God would create physical creatures with specific weaknesses. You kinda have to wonder why he'd make physical creatures at all, or for that matter the very physical universe he'd have to fine-tune to accommodate them. According to the modern Christian concept of God anyway, he was a pure ethereal mind. Bodiless, eternal, invincible. And apparently, in the midst of this timeless existence, he wanted some other version of himself to fellowship with. Right? I mean, you might quibble over the phrasing, but one way or another it seems the point was he wanted another conscious mind to have a relationship with him. So without our preconception about life as physical organic entities, try to consider what square one in this process would look like for him. He was a purely spiritual mind, and he wanted something else similar to him, one might say made in his image, to interact with. Wouldn't the most straightforward move be to make another spiritual mind similar to him? Sure, he might want to make it more limited and even temporal in some capacity, if just to make sure he was sufficiently superior and it was sufficiently humble, since that seems to be his thing. But why invent the idea of physical matter in a physical universe and throw it into the mix? And why make it so that some of this physical matter needed to be tenuously arranged into a thing called a brain that needed to be kept intact for the mind to keep existing? And why make this brain not only incredibly fragile, but dependent on a physical body that not only has its own vulnerabilities, but must be physically maintained with a constant supply of oxygen, a daily supply of water, and ideally a daily supply of fuel which, bizarrely enough, needed to be harvested from other life forms he'd created? And why make this body so that, even if cared for perfectly under the best circumstances, it would wear out and be destroyed anyway? Why create this brain so that tampering with it would alter the mind's immediate temperament and even long-term personality? Why make it so that the mind spends so much of its life barely lucid to the point of being infantile at birth and often diminished or demented in old age? You have to wonder not only why God would choose to do this, but how such a weird series of ideas even occurred to him. And this is all just a weird, unnecessary prelude to the mind being freed of the body at death to become the same ideal spiritual being God could have created it as from the start. Yet apparently he wanted our fate of eternal bliss or eternal torment to be decided in a brief window living in these weird, unnecessary, temporary circumstances. A time when, we'd have access to very limited information and our decision-making process was vulnerable to any number of things that could happen to our brains during our lifetime? I mean, God's mind didn't require a physical brain, right? So how did it even occur to him to go this route, and why would he choose to do it? It makes no sense. Yet this is what Christians propose God did. Then some of them propose that it's amazing he fine-tuned the universe he never needed to create to accommodate weaknesses he arbitrarily went out of his way to give life forms that never needed to be placed in physical frail bodies to begin with. This is where intelligent design is so obscenely stupid at its foundations that all the other objections feel almost frivolous. So that's why, yes, I think the fine-tuning argument is trash. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.